and the variable is the differentiated aid. And that relative to the adequacy costs, you raised a number of questions that were valid, good observations about how to tweak that. Is there a mechanism for us to gather that information in a more thorough way? I appreciate 3 insights here, but if we just bank it on 3 opinions, it's not as well grounded. So you have an association of school business officers in the state. We have a fairly tight timeline for our task. And I'm wondering if we were to migrate from the basis on which $4,700 is drawn to something that perhaps is a little more inclusive and also a little more defined on the basis, on the cost basis, actual cost. So we got both what ought to be in it, and then what are the costs? Do they need to be adjusted? Those are 2 questions you've raised, right? And is there a mechanism for us to collect those costs in a comprehensive way in a short period of time?
While the guys think about how the association can help, I guess I would say I agree that I think you asked the question at the beginning, and I just want to say it out loud, that it feels to me at least that there are elements of the definition that need to be changed. We didn't touch on everything. It was a cursory overview, right? But I think that definitely there are things that are in our standards, are in the mandates we face, that could reasonably and should be reflected in a revised definition. And that, in a short period of time, I believe that the School Business Officials Association could certainly help with a small group or with other feedback. But again, that still will be a limited number of opinions. But when you're talking about changing the definition and looking for input there, I think that might be meaningful assistance. In terms of cost, I look at the other guys and say, help. Picking up aggregate costs to make it?
Yeah, I think what would, I can just speak for how I kind of operate and how I kind of do things, and we're in 2 districts that are big enough. Our SAU is 1,900 students, where we're big enough where some of the way that we do things gets aggregated, but we're also small enough where I can pick out, like if somebody came to me and said, what's the cost of a nurse? That's easy to pick. I can pick that pretty easy because that's its own section. When you get into the, what is your cost, per student for PE expenses, physical education expenses, that's a little bit more difficult, I think, for people, as that gets wrapped up into this bigger section of the budget, that 1,100 regular education section that we kind of operate in. If the commission said these are the things that we think should be in the adequacy calculation, what do these things cost? I think pretty quickly I could determine that, and I do things school-based, so I could probably determine that on a school basis as well. When you get into some of the bigger districts, I have no idea how that would look for a place like Manchester or Concord or places like that, where you're talking, thousands of students, at each kind of bucket, at elementary, middle, and high school.
But we do have everyone's email and can get stuff out quickly, and usually people are good about turning stuff in to answer your question, Senator. And another easy way to do it is if you guys had specific data. If the Department of Ed sends that out, they do this all the time. They send it out to our bosses and say, we need this filled out by this date. And they'll just forward it to us and we'll fill it out. you'll get, you know, 80%, 90% participation.
Yeah, our group tends to be a bit of the rule following variety. So if you send us something, I think we're gonna probably do it.
So I think the answer, one answer maybe is some of what you might want to institutionalize in the formula can today be drawn from the state reporting that we already do. Because as Dwayne said, something like nursing services, health services, that's called out pretty easily on our end. And I believe the department could fairly easily tweak our reporting expectation to help you call that out on an annual basis moving forward as need be, or biannual basis. Some of them will still be harder because they're more difficult to identify and capture locally. And as a result, they'll be exponentially harder to collect and capture on a statewide basis. And we could offer, I think, input on what those are or how we might best address those.
So Jed, do you want to shift gears here? I think this has been
we're going to need to.
An appetizer in front of
we
what's
will need to, and a couple of those areas that we didn't touch on and that we're, so maybe there's some additional dialogue we can have with you, but we didn't touch on early childhood education, career technical education, food programs, school safety programs. So there are a couple of other areas where it's just not clear how much of those activities are a part of your fixed adequacy costs and how much of those vary depending where you are. Just to say, we covered a lot of territory and there's a lot more territory to cover. So I guess we'll follow up and try to identify how do we engage some of your expertise in the future. Thanks so much for giving us your time today, and I think we've gained some valuable insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thank you for working to make our state better educated. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome to stay as we switch our presentation, but we'll excuse you if you've got other duties.
Thank you.
Jane Bergeron, you have assembled a group of special educators for us. Would you like to do the introductions?
Sure, I would be happy to. We have today with us Dr. Jennifer Dolliff, who is the Student Services Coordinator for the Goffstown School District. We have Mary Steady, who's the Director of Student Services for the Manchester School District, and Kim DeSalvo, who is from the Pemmy Baker Regional School District, which includes Plymouth and all of the surrounding towns. As the commission suggested, we tried to get varied demographics, a large city, middle-sized SAU, and one of the largest geographic SAUs that also has differing student demographics and community demographics. And I know Bruce has worked with them to present some questions to think about. So I'll turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Mary, Kim, and Jennifer for being available today. And I'm glad you sat in on that earlier conversation to set the big picture for some of the specific major cost drivers in our districts that you all represent. So again, you have the specific questions that we posed, but we're also happy to get kind of big picture comments from you as well, especially as you get started. And I think you understand the Commission's charge and this work group's interest in understanding the current definitions of adequacy and how that cost is calculated, and then what's missing and what legitimately, for what there's a good argument for expanding that core definition, that universal cost definition. So in this case, maybe we'll start just in, let's go in alphabetical order this time. So Kim, and then Jennifer, and then Mary. So Kim, you want to start us off?
Hi, how are you? Are we just going just straight down the questions? Is that how
Yeah,
you want to
just
go
take a
about
few
that?
minutes, just 10 minutes or so to reflect on these questions, and then any other thoughts, and then we'll go round robin and then have a little bit of time
Sure,
for discussion.
sure, absolutely. First question is asking about cost trends relative delivering special ed over the past 5 years. What are the causes of the increase in the cost that you've seen? I think for us up in SAU 48, the costs rise every year. Definitely lately in the areas of social emotional needs. So that's driving a lot of cost for us. Schools are finding themselves becoming engaged and funding some things that maybe they hadn't in the past with regard to social emotional. And for us, particularly in SAU 48, preschool is driving a lot of costs. We're having a lot of students enter our schools unprepared for the kindergarten environment, who are needing preschool. And just a little bit on a little funding for preschool, the IDA grant gives our SAU, which is 9 school districts combined, I think we get about $8,500 in the IDA grant. That's the cost to educate just one special needs preschooler. So it's a little interesting. As far as the mix of funding that we receive, obviously local budgets from taxes and towns, and that is definitely different when you look at the type of schools that we have and the towns that we have. So we go from a town such as Waterville Valley or Holderness, who have a pretty good tax base, to a larger town like Plymouth, which is our Plymouth Elementary School District, and also our Pemmy Baker Regional School District, which is our high school, is in Plymouth. And then some very small school districts, such as Rumney and Wentworth, that are very rural, very small tax base. So any cost in special education are really felt in those 2 particular districts. Out of placement costs, as far as our SAU 48, and our 9 school districts, our out of district placement costs are mostly court ordered. Students who, through either DCYF or through the court system, have been placed in an out of district setting. We maybe have 2 other students who are school placed. So the majority of our out of district students aren't placed by us. We do have a charter school. The 4th question does talk about charter schools. We do have a charter school in the town of Plymouth. It's right now it's an elementary charter school, and we have 1 to 2 students, I would say, from each of our towns involved in that charter school. And obviously we fund the special ed costs for that, which is pretty difficult for 1 school in Wentworth to have 1 student there, and to try to fund sending a teacher over there, and another school in Holderness trying to send 1 teacher over there, or to send a speech therapist over there, and 1 or 2 students from Plymouth and trying to send. So it's hard to organize, and it's expensive for those towns to have teachers traveling back and forth. So I'm looking for the next question. And what is the relationship between the incidence of poverty and the identification of children with special needs? I would say in our SAU, and I can't speak for the others, we are at about 16% across the board. So I think that's because we are under 1 SAU, and we strive to provide the same services across all of our schools. So it's that sort of same quality and consistency throughout. Maybe if we were separate school districts, not under an SAU umbrella, that might be a little different, but because we do have that centralized, director of student services, such as myself, who's working with all of the schools individually. I think that's why our average is generally about the same. I suppose if you want to ask questions, or everybody wants to take a turn, I'm not sure how you want to go about it.
Do you want me to go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
So I just would like to take a moment to just sort of give you my background because it does inform my presentation about what we're doing. I started as a teacher in Bedford for 7 years, and it was special education, phenomenal. I moved to as a coordinator to SAU 38, and I was in charge of special ed for 10 different districts, 2 of which were Winchester and Hinsdale. I was there when Thayer Academy was shut down. I was at a NEASC presentation when the library essentially caught on fire because the heating was so bad. Then I went to Nashua, and I was the director of Nashua for 5 years. And that was sort of the heyday. I think things were going fairly well, and Adequacy was a little different then. I left Nashua to work at Ceresc, and I sat on the team for the DOE program approval, the Bureau of Special Ed. So I audited districts. And so I've been to every district in the state. I also finished my doctorate at that time, and it was on education funding. It was specifically, and I spent many years researching it. It was district level factors and their predictive ability, certainly for achievement. And it was based on New Hampshire. So there's been a lot of New Hampshire research done. I didn't note any of it in your you know, paperwork that you have. There was somebody actually at your institute that did some research on this, and it was exceptional. So after that, I went to Manchester. I went right to Manchester because I felt that was a great place to go to deal with education funding. And I left within a year. I resigned, and I can tell you that, you know, the disparity in funding is significant. I'm in Goffstown with a great school board in New Boston and a superintendent that's very knowledgeable now about school funding and so forth. The disparities are significant. I mean, there's a theory of economy of scale that gets tossed around a lot, particularly business directors. There's actually a diseconomy of scale. So when you go to a larger district like Manchester, this is proven through research in Nashua, the larger the district gets, the more challenging it actually is to fund. I've got schools I've worked with that had 98% poverty and received some of the fewest per pupil dollars in the state. It just doesn't make sense. We're rated as one of the top 7 most affluent states in the country. Yet the disparities, I think we do spend a lot. I think the disparities are significant district to district. I think Waterville Valley is up around 40 something per student, whereas this one building I'm telling you about, the children get 9 per pupil, 9,000. And yet they're dealing with poverty, multiple languages and ethnicity factors that really contribute to everything. So looking at that from that perspective, and so I wanted to just go over special ed specifically because I have a great deal to say about funding overall, but I think this is not what you're asking for. You just want to hear the special ed at this point. So we've got Chapter 402 costs that I wanted to talk briefly about, special education aid, formerly catastrophic aid, and preschool costs. So with Chapter 402 costs, those are the court-ordered costs. So if you're working in a district, a more affluent district, you might get a court-ordered placement form, you know, once a month, maybe twice a month, and everybody focuses on it and you deal with it. In the larger districts, you get hundreds, and you're getting court-ordered placements, just impossible to deal with the numbers, particularly when the district can't even afford an administrative assistant for the role. So the court-ordered paperwork is huge for the districts that struggle with poverty and disparity and all of that. But the other thing is that it's changed. So Chapter 402 requires that the state pick up the costs for anything that's 3 times the state average and beyond. So if a student gets placed by the courts, let's say in an out-of-district placement, we could traditionally in the past, we would pay our 3 times and then the state would pick up the rest. So the states changed the rules. So now this, without you know, legislation or anything, it was just sort of rule change by memo. We now have to apply not to pay those costs above. And so there's a whole 3-page list of things that can go wrong that prevent you from no longer paying the 3.5 times. And I could list those, but one simply being if a parent refuses to sign the IEP and you don't have it signed on time, well, that community then has to continue to pay for that court-ordered placement, despite the fact that the law says otherwise. So again, most of our placements out of district are court ordered or charter, and we have a few that are out other than that. But so there's little control with Chapter 402 monies. My screen just went blank.
We can still see you. I think
You
we're
can
all
see me?
here.
I'm sorry. So
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'll continue to go on. I'm just trying to flip to my. Thank you. Sorry. So so Chapter 402 has changed significantly, as I mentioned, in the 30 years. Now, you know, we can spar with the DOE and try to get a stop on the costs, but it's you know, the payback is sometimes very difficult. With special education aid, that's 3.5 times. So the law is that districts who have sort of catastrophic costs for an individual special ed student, the law is that they pay the state will pay 80% of anything above 3.5 times the state average. But then that's prorated based on what the legislature has to offer. So sometimes we get 60% only of that 80, you know. So that money never comes back to the special ed department either. So it looks as though the sped department, I mean, we still look as though we're the sort of the burden with special ed. Even if money is coming back, it doesn't necessarily come back to the district or to the department. So it's very challenging in that sense. I do have some figures. I looked, so the DOE used to have, and I have enormous data on the website. All of that data has been wiped off, which makes it challenging to look back. I can tell you a couple of things, analyses I did before we lost the data. There's a positive relationship between poverty and what was the question I had? And disability. So as poverty increases, the percentage of students with disabilities increases. And that's a strong positive relationship. So whether we, you know, we like to be a meritocracy and we view things as all equal, the reality is that the higher the poverty rate, the higher the incidence of disability. In this other data, as far as IDEA grant money, in fiscal year 08, for the state, we've got $46 million. So in fiscal year 2019, the state only received $43 million. So as our costs have continued to go up, the money coming from the state, I don't know if that goes somewhere else at the DOE level, but we're getting smaller and smaller amounts of IDEA funds as costs continue to increase. Court-ordered placements in 2009, the districts got over 3,200,000 in court-ordered placement reimbursements. In fiscal year 17, we got about 1,500,000. So our court-ordered costs have gone up astronomically, and again, we're getting far less back in reimbursements. The beauty of the Chapter 402 is was supposed to be that the school district didn't have to pay up front, but now that we have to jump through a lot of different hoops, it's much more challenging. A couple of the factors that have caused an increase. Our out-of-district placement costs were pretty static for years. With the current administration, the tuition rates at out-of-district placements have gone up 5% annually. So that's compounding now. So the costs of out-of-district placements are skyrocketing, and there's really no venue to go and to sort of work that through. It just keeps increasing. We've lost considerable amounts of money in Medicaid. I think you folks are aware that we lost our Medicaid revenues. I'm not sure exactly why or how that can be changed. And then preschool, while we're one of only 4 states that doesn't provide any preschool funding, in special ed, we're obligated to provide preschool to classrooms with a 50-50 split. So we actually have to bring in non-disabled kids to fill our preschool classes, which costs more money for teachers. It costs more money for space. We have to transport kids. So despite the fact that the state doesn't provide any preschool, we have pretty huge demands on the special ed department in providing preschool. Just want to make sure I covered everything. I can tell you in my research, the gap between, we have disparities. The biggest disparity is with poverty. When you look at students with poverty and you compare them to all students without poverty, not living in poverty, for example, there's a greater gap than there are for students who are, Black or Hispanic, meaning that there's a huge gap for that as well, but it's really poverty across the state. I think we still have a small population of students who are speaking foreign languages and who come from a different background as far as ethnicity. So poverty plays a huge role. Urbanicity plays a huge role. I think while we talk a lot about the fact that we're rural and we need to address the needs of rural districts, I think some of our larger districts are sort of like the Mississippis of the state, meaning there's some real disadvantages. I will say there's a bunch of research from Bruce Baker and others who in the field of ed finance, and I think I've mentioned it to folks before. We were several years identified as having the biggest disparity in spending between students living in poverty and those not, and students with ethnicity, Black and Hispanic students, about 2,000 less per pupil spent in high poverty districts than in districts with very low poverty. And then there's a whole middle range. So there's a bunch of research out there, and it's a very challenging problem, I understand. But I hope to cover everything in that short period.
Okay, I guess I'll go now. Hi, I'm Mary Steady. I'm from Manchester School District, and as Jen said, and when she was throwing out some of those numbers, those are Manchester's numbers. So thank you, Jen, for being so articulate with that. I appreciate it. For me to talk about special ed, it's hard to speak about it in isolation because that's not what the law requires. It is supplemental services. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of Manchester School District because I think that we forget how large Manchester School District is. There's about 14,000 students in Manchester School District within 22 schools. We have about 3,000 special ed kids. So I heard one of the school districts saying that we are a pretty good sized school and we have 1,500 students. Well, we have double of that is just special education students. We have about 21 English language learners in our city, about 70 some odd different languages spoken in Manchester. Our free and reduced population is about 61% at this point, with some of our schools being up at 97%, with nearly, I think about 99% of them getting free lunch. We have 57% of our students are white, Caucasian, and about 43% are other race and ethnicities. So we are quite diverse. It's a wonderful place. When I live in a small town, so I step out of my predominantly white small town and I go to this wonderful school district that just it's amazing to be there. I think we need to remember that. I might not address these in order because one of the areas that I have spent some time in is really trying to understand charter schools and how that impacts Manchester. So Manchester has about 19% of the charter schools in the city. There are 6 of them in Manchester, with new ones developing every single year. When we look at special education law, we need to remember special education is supplemental services. And supplemental, it's the easiest way to understand this. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says your vitamin D is low, they give you a supplement. They give you vitamin D. You don't stop eating and just take your vitamin D. So when we look at charter schools and we look at how our state regulations are around that and the laws on that, the special education department of the local LEA where that kid originally reside is fully responsible for all of those supplemental services, yet we have no say or accountability over the core. So we don't get to say, like in our public school, if we are looking at the local school and we're looking at supplemental and we're looking at progress, we're looking at failure to implement IEPs or the successes, we have control over that core diet. And we have control over the supplemental services. When we go to a charter school, we don't have control over the core, but we are fully responsible financially and accountable for the special education progress. So for instance, I'll give you 2 examples. If our charter schools model is to have a paraprofessional in each class, because that's the way they operate, and they only want 2 special education students per class. We actually have to fund those paraprofessionals, each of those classes, because our students are there. Where we may do a different model where we may bring 4 kids into that one class in the local school, and we'd put 1 paraprofessional. So it would reduce that cost for us, and the student would still get those robust services. If we're looking at the charter school cost in Manchester, it's over $1 million for us to pay for supplemental services. And, you know, I think when the law was written, they would say, oh, well, if a kid is leaving the local school, the money just follows that kid and it's no big deal. But when you have 20 some odd kids in a charter school and they're coming from your 14 elementary schools, that's not, and if you had 2 kids from each elementary, K to 5, that's not going to impact your budget at all. You're not reducing anything. You can't reduce teachers. You can't reduce any other supports. However, now you're not only responsible for providing those services, now you've created a special education system within that charter school. So the law says that we provide services, not system level. So, so then we have to create somebody in our district to be able to oversee all of that. So that's an additional cost. And I think, and it's not, I don't want you to think that I don't believe in charter schools, because that's not at all where this is coming from. I just believe we really need to relook at this funding piece of the local LEA having that responsibility for the fiscal piece and the full accountability when we don't even have any say over that core. Another piece, and I've spoken to the commissioner, and I've written to the commissioner on this and a couple of times, who gets to decide the cost of those services at the charter school? So what I'm saying, what I mean by this is, if they have a group of students and they charge you $45 an hour per student, there are 6 kids in that group, 1 maybe from your school, there could be 5 from other schools, you times the 45 by, times it by 6, is it really that true cost to deliver that 1 hour of service? I'm not sure it really is, but we don't get to pick and choose how much we're charging. And when I have tried to peel back the onion on those layers to say, okay, what does it cost? Please send me how many students are in the groups that you're saying. I don't need to know what schools they're from. I just need to know how many of ours, and you're charging 45 times 6, and I should only have to pay a certain percentage of that, because it's really only costing you $70 for that. The other piece is IDA requires us to provide special education by a certified special educator. In charter schools, they don't necessarily have to hire certified teachers. So there's some conflicts in the law right there. We could have a special educator at the charter school, not even certified. So we're in violation right there, but we have to either decide to send our staff, and is that, it's probably not an economic advantage for us to be driving sometimes 20 miles for an hour of service. It'd be better for us to pay them, but they don't have the certified staff. We can't understand how much it really is costing per hour. Some of them won't provide that information. Some of them have been great about that, but it took me a year to get that information, and an enormous amount of legal fees between both the charter school and the public school, local public school, and to be able to come to a negotiated agreement around that. I was able to drop one contract from 300,000 down to 200,000. So, but how much did it cost me in legal fees, the stress, the ruining of the relationships, all of those things that go into this. And the child gets lost in this. And so I think we need to think about that. So that's my spiel on charter school cost. So the other pieces, what have we seen that drives special education cost up over time? In Manchester, we're seeing an increase as Jen, we get hundreds of court-ordered placements. The placements could change on a kid 3 times in 3 weeks. And so we're trying to follow and chase that. And we're technically supposed to have an IEP signed for each single one of those placements. Sometimes by the time we get that court order, we get the notice, trying to get that IEP signed and back out by the parent. We're playing catch up all the time. When we look at the cost, the number of court-ordered placements, they're going up every year. The cost to our, like the cap that we have to hit goes up every year. And we're getting more of those. So we have to, the cost that it would cost us to provide special education in our local district, those kids are now in an out-of-district placement, court-ordered there. We have to pay for that. We don't get a choice to say, let's ship them back to our public school, because guess what? They may have been doing fine in our public school, but maybe at home or in the community is where this child is getting in trouble. So now we're paying, when we'd probably be paying $20,000 for this child's education, now we're paying $42,000, $50,000. When we look at catastrophic aid over time, and we look at, I ran some of those numbers when I first got there, we are having more students hit that cap, but the cap keeps getting higher, but our reimbursement rate keeps getting lower. So at one point, I think I have some data here on that. Let me just see if I can pull that up real quick for you. At one point, our cap for SPED aid, catastrophic aid, was, the cap was 50,000. And we were getting 90% reimbursement on that. Now, a few years ago, the cap was higher, 53%, and we were only getting 72% reimbursement. So not only is the cap getting higher, our reimbursement's getting lower. So that's driving the cost. Transportation drives the cost when we have to provide, it's a related service for kids to ensure FAPE for them. So we have to sometimes contract at really high cost to be able to get kids to school, especially if they're in out of district. It would be nothing to pay $300 to $500 a day in transportation costs for some kids. That's very high. I think I may have hit on almost all of the points. Poverty, Jen spoke about that. We are 61% of our students are in free reduced lunch. We have high poverty needs, and our identification rate in Manchester is pretty high. It's 21%, and that's not necessarily indicative of people not following the law. It's a response system at sometimes. We know kids can get services, and we need to say that this child, they're coming in from an environment that could have been toxic with opioid crisis going on in Manchester, all the trauma, all of those things coming into school, and this child needs more from their education. And sometimes it's really hard to tease out what is an environmental factor versus what is a true educational disability. So I'll stop now. I could, as Jen and Kim are, we're pretty passionate about this, and we could speak about it all day long.
Can I just add to that as well? The court-ordered placements provide motivation for kids to be identified. So if a child's placed by the courts into a placement and they're not identified, that's not paid by the district or the state. So when a court placement is made, we're forced to go now and look at a child and do a referral on them and consider special ed. There was a James O consent decree that expired a couple of years ago that required us to do that. Now the state boards adopted that practice. So there's incentive to identify every child placed in placements, because then there's a funding source, and it's becoming more and more the district's funding source, obviously. But there's a lot of incentives built in of that nature that makes it very challenging. The other thing is charter school funding. It's incredibly unique to New Hampshire. Nobody else requires the public schools to provide special ed. The average cost of a child for special ed is considered twice the per pupil, statewide per pupil. So we're at about $30,000 to educate a child with special needs. recreating special ed in charter schools is very challenging. I actually sat on the board of the next charter school in Derry, which has got a nice funding stream because it's public. But it's just not something people are willing to discuss, but it's very unique, again, to New Hampshire.
I'd love to just follow up on your point there about when there is the adequacy, or I'm sorry, the differentiated aid for special ed headcounts. Are those students who are in the charter schools a part of the district's headcount?
So that's another challenge. I'll tell you, when I was in Manchester, we were supposed to be getting the differentiated aid for the charter school kids, but we weren't. So we had to sort of work with the DOE to make sure we got that differentiated aid, which was close to 100,000. But it was incredibly challenging. It's hard because charter school, I think it may have improved. But so the charter school differentiated aid is the only money we get, and it's very small. I think it's 1,900 or something. But you got to make sure you're getting it, because following where students are and so forth is challenging. But it doesn't make that much of a difference as far as how we're able to provide special ed programming.
And I think we need to remember charter schools, kids come back and forth. So that makes it challenging too.
Come back and forth, I mean?
So they could start out in the year in Manchester School District, move to a charter school, come back to Manchester School District, be court ordered somewhere else. And the kids some kids, it's just it's tracking them. I mean, we do a great job doing that, but we need to remember, even if we got money, or if the kid started at the charter school and they got them, they could a week later end up in our public school.
So I want to ask this question, and I'm sure others have, but should we be considering more costs that in the special education funding stream? You've pointed out a number of places where there are costs that are not recognized as a part of a special education funding and costing stream. Should we be recognizing those costs as part of that special ed funding stream, or within an adequacy education?
I think the challenge is that you sometimes provide incentives and disincentives. I think that adequacy is so underfunded. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, sort of incentivizing by adding adequate, differentiated aid is necessarily going to have the same impact as far, compared to increasing adequacy overall. But it's certainly something to consider.
I think that if we just look at our federal grant dollars we get, and I think Kim said this nicely, Manchester gets $120,000 from IDA for preschool. We have almost 400 students. That allows us to provide for 9 students. And Jen had said we have to, the way the regulations are written, there's 2 types of programs you offer in preschool. You offer an early childhood education program where 50% of those students or more have to be students without disabilities. Or you offer a self-contained program, which you have to get the Department of Education's approval to run. And that is 50% or more students have disabilities. You have to operate both of these programs. So the programs have, and there's a cap on those self-contained programs. You can only have 12 students at the most in them. And that's a lot for a preschool anyways, when you have that kids with significant disabilities. So when you run those self-contained programs, and you can only have up to 12, and we try to keep it at 10, and sometimes we're at 12 with it, just depending on the nature of the program. You have to have so many teachers, but we get $120,000 a year, and there's no other funding for preschool.
May I have a quick follow-up on that?
Yeah.
in the 50-50 classrooms, or in the preschool classrooms, for the children not identified, so-called typically developing children that are they're integrated into the special education preschool, do your districts or to others that you know of charge families tuition for that preschool service, or is that wrapped into the operating budget of the district?
So because we have 511 students in our preschool program, we can't offer it to students outside of kids getting Title I services because we just don't have the capacity, the money, the budgeting. It's something that we're looking at. So we're using some Title I funding for that. We were at one point offering some tuition, but it was really, really low. It wouldn't have covered the cost for much.
I see. So you're using Title I dollars. So all the kids that are the so-called typically developing kids that are integrated into the preschools are also kids that they're in districts that are eligible for schools.
Yeah, and at-risk kids. Yeah.
Yeah, and many districts do charge, you know, and you do make exceptions, and it doesn't compensate for the cost, but it's a variety of ways of funding it. It's a challenge.
I'd like to add just there's a hidden cost to preschool in a district, an SAU such as ours with a large geographic region. We couldn't afford to have a preschool in a small school like Wentworth and one in Rumney and one in Thornton. So we have 2 preschool programs in 2 of our schools. The hidden cost is the transportation to take a student from Wentworth and transport them twice a day for 2.5 hours to a preschool setting can cost about $100,000 a year just for one little preschooler. And we have to do it because otherwise, they couldn't get there. Parents are working, parents don't have cars or are unable for other reasons. So in order for them to get FAPE and to attend the preschool, then we have to pay that. So aside from, you could have, your $9,000 cost for the preschooler and then another $100,000 to transport them. So that's a lot. That's the killer in it. So for a small school like Wentworth with one little preschooler, when you look at the school budget and you say, oh my gosh, what is this transportation cost? And you find out it's for a preschooler to go to a preschool for 2.5 hours. I mean, which is wonderful, but I don't think the taxpayer always understands the value there.
Kim, I can say the same thing. Even Manchester doesn't have preschool in every single one of their schools. Out of their 14 schools, they only have it in 6 of them. So we're transporting all across the district for this 2.5 hours too. Some kids go for a longer day, depending on the program they're in, but that's an added cost for us as well because we do not offer it in every single school.
So I think sort of the takeaway is that our costs continue to go up with maternal pregnancies, with opioid addiction and social emotional issues, but our revenues continue to go down. So that's a challenge.
I have a question. New Hampshire is known for being a highly inclusive state, right from, starting in the early 80s, and the Institute for Disabilities has been a champion of this. Our Department of Ed holds us to some pretty high expectations around inclusive practices. How does that impact? It's much easier to have a self-contained program with 12 kids and 1 teacher, and the kids stay there all together. What is the difference between like a self-contained model versus an inclusive model where special education teachers and all of the related service staff have to be out in the classrooms with the kids and the paraprofessionals that support them? Is that something that impacts our expenses in our school districts?
Yes, I think that you'll see that our paraprofessional numbers are increased probably comparatively to other states because we are very inclusive and always have been. So it plays a role.
Yeah, I think that
I would say.
Go ahead, Kim.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I would say absolutely. I worked prior to being in New Hampshire. I worked for Bergen County Special Services in New Jersey, and the model is well, at the time it was not inclusion. So we had students coming to special needs schools, Jane, and we had one OT, one PT, maybe 2 speech therapists. Now I have teams and teams of therapists, and that's just looking at therapists and not teachers. So I would say, yeah, it's a big difference.
Another thing that the committee could look at is just the number of school psychologists per district and the number of speech paths. There's huge disparities. I mean, one of the largest districts in the state, you know, at one point had 11 school psychologists, while tiny little districts had, you know, multiple for each. So just looking at those numbers, I think would provide a great deal of information.
I think that the other area that you need to look at is all the related support services that need to go in to keep kids at their local school district, which you want to do. Over time, it is cheaper, but you have to have social workers so you can reach out to the parents. We have to have a case when you're talking about a special educator, they're teaching and lesson planning all day, yet they have to, the amount of paperwork and the special ed process, the amount of time that is put into that, it's almost like they have a dual role there. And so therefore it takes out of their time to be able to be in the classroom all the time like we would like them to be. But when you think of, you know, the school counselors, social workers, the mental health people coming into schools, OT, PT, speech, ABA services, we could have a kid with autism and it would be nothing if they needed that level of support all day long with them. It would cost us $75,000 just for that one person to be with them. And when you're talking about the numbers that Manchester has, it's easy for us to contract at that point 10 or 15 people at 75,000 just for that. That's not including their speech or their OT. It's not including the teacher to teach them, the special educator, the amount of time, administrator costs. I mean, I think Jen said, you know, some of our school districts, when I got to Manchester, I didn't even have any support. I mean, Jen was in there before me and there is no secretary there, administrative support there. So you're doing everything. And I think it's not a complaint about any sort of system. It's just that when you only have X amount of dollars and those dollars have to go towards the student because they have such complex needs, we're left short being able to do all the other things at the level that we would like to do it.
Yeah, Chris.
You've all had a lot of experience in different kinds of schools and classrooms, and I'm wondering if you think that some of the and New Hampshire has always had a high identification rate. A lot of that with students who may be less involved. And I'm wondering if, in your observations, if there were changes to the core curriculum or changes to other kinds of instructional and other services, if you think that the identification rate for kids who are less involved would be lower and therefore allow a different kind of concentration on the children with really complex needs.
I think one of the unintended consequences of this whole testing movement that I think we're seeing hasn't really increased achievement, but one of the unintended consequences of reform has been that gamesmanship and more need to identify. I think schools that are inclusive are meeting everybody's needs and are flexible, are able to do it without having to tell a child that they're educationally disabled. I sat on CINES and DINES, School in Need of Improvement committees and so forth. We moved principals around. It all sort of destroyed, I think, the core of academics. And I'm hopeful that we'll move away from that to a more student-centered program.
So Dave, I'm looking at the little time check here. If we want to have a little bit of time for the work group to look at that scope of work, but this has been so interesting. I feel informed and a little overwhelmed by getting this inside view of how you all are dealing with this.
Thank you.
It's a complex area. and I think you've given us some things to think about, and mostly as to what are the challenges in the funding stream that's directed towards the special needs of students, and that whole range. You've widened the lens on that. Thanks a lot for doing
Thank
that.
you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for asking us. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Applause all around. Bruce, what's our next task?
Well, we did want to get this work group to take one more look at the scope of work with AIR. The challenge is that that's a challenging task. So let me see here. I can call up, let's see. I can call up the current version, or Jordan, actually, I might ask you if you can share the current version of the scope of work. The challenge is that the version we have is probably hard to work with because it's all
Right. We had a version on Monday that we took a look at. There's a shortened version of that now, right? And I don't know that that's been shared back with this group, has it?
No, it hasn't. No.
No, because that was. It'd be helpful to have that out before we talk about it, Jay and Bruce.
Yeah.
We could be more efficient in examining it. And this is a very hard part of this kind of awkward way of doing meetings. I understand that. I'm not complaining, other than it'd be nice to have that document in advance.
So David, given the ability for everybody to participate equally in that conversation right now, and the need to have something, a timeline, Bruce, David, Monday, right? Tuesday for the full commission to have a sign off there. Got some thoughts, because this, I don't think we're going to get too far down this conversation.
So I want to start by sort of reflecting on some comments that Chris made earlier this week, that the folks at AIR are professionals. They've done this before. They're looking at Vermont and Kansas as recent examples of what they've done, and are using New England specific data, New Hampshire specific context data, and also putting a heavy reliance on the outcome-based model that I think was developed in Massachusetts for informing this work. And I went through again, since back it seems a million years ago, when we were reading two proposals, and went back over the statement of work, just the AIR statement of work, with I think having a different lens to read that, as opposed to trying to compare it with something else. Just sort of read it for what it is, and there are there's some notes and questions I took on the side. Nothing where I had strong disagreement with, or felt that it was not on track, but I think it ties in with what Jay and I have been talking about over the last few days too, which is the adequacy work group's task of defining and costing adequacy, and AIR's focus on developing weights to which I think get applied to a base. Jay, you're there.
We got to jump off for a call on the CARES Act stuff. I believe you're doing a great job on this, and I can defer to the team with everybody, Chris, but I apologize for signing off now. I'm sorry.
Bill, thank you very much, and we'll get the document out to everybody so that we can collect comments. final round. So
Thanks, Bill.
great, thank you. Enjoy the weekend too. Um, so um, really, that was my probably my really only material comment now on the statement of work is how that dovetails with what Adequacy Work Group wants to do with defining adequacy from the bushel basket, because I think they talked about a regression approach to get to it, and it's probably good that it be looked at, from two ends. So.
I think when it comes to the definition of adequacy, I think this group really needs to own that. We need to ground ourselves and think about what else do you need to know to help contribute to that definition. AIR's strength, and they've got some great strength to look at educational outcomes and identify the factors that contribute to it. So I don't think we need to worry about rural index and dense populations and advantages and lack thereof. They're going to tease out those additional variables that are socioeconomically based. Key for us, and I mean, they'll factor in the availability of early childhood education and special ed, but they're not going to be able to do what those school business officers were leading us to incorporate, and at what cost it ought to be incorporated. So we have this task that is pretty key to the overall final report. And we need to efficiently move towards that, because eventually AIR's data is going to catch up, and we're going to want to be there to work with them on what are the disparities relative to socioeconomic inputs and educational outcomes. So that's what I see as our conceptual challenge for this work group.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things when we talked to our team on Tuesday this week, for others of you that weren't on that call, they are clear that we're the ones defining adequacy, not them. They're not going to give us a definition. They'll give us some benchmarks to look at and some comparable language from other states, but that's just as a resource to us. Second, they did hear that they do need to tweak the deliverable language, particularly in what's deliverable 2, if you look on their document, to include reference to helping us with our process in defining adequacy. That was not explicit in their initial draft of their scope of work. We did ask them to make that more explicit. They said yes, they would. We haven't seen that revision yet. I sent a note to Jesse this morning asking when we could see that, but it's just 9 o'clock in the morning his time right now. So once we get the revised scope of work, I assume sometime today, we can distribute that out to the full commission and ask for feedback and comments in preparation for Tuesday's meeting.
Great.
Yep. I think that the takeaway that I got from today was from the business officers, a lot of the right things are in the adequacy cost. The costs aren't accurately calculated. And what I got from the special education presentation is there are a lot of unrecognized costs to that, to the delivery of services. But that's not going to be able to be recognized in an adequacy formula. It could be in differentiated aid, but anyway, those are 2 takeaways, I guess, for me.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too about how business officers talked about the costs associated with education in rural communities, where the student services administrators talked about the increased cost of student services in higher density settings. So it really does get down to understanding the district, and efficiency is not necessarily a scale, or I shouldn't say efficiency. Cost function is not necessarily a factor of scale.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that kudos to Jay and whoever else found these excellent panelists, because they were great.
Mm-hmm.
And they really dug down beneath the surface, so certainly helped me. And in talking, the other thing is in talking about adequacy, if we want to use on occasion this fixed and variable notion, let's not lose sight of the fact that the variable or differentiated part of it that we're interested in is adequacy too. So it's base plus equals adequacy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting that both groups identified factors that are really affecting our costs that we may have to assume are outside the purview of our commission. And I don't know how we think about that or deal with that, whether you call it the inefficiencies, whether you call it, I'm reading between the lines, and certainly what others outside of New Hampshire have said about our special ed system is that the level of, we've taken inclusivity to the extreme, and it may not actually be serving our special ed students as well. But that's clearly not something that this commission is going to deal with, but it's a huge cost factor. So we have, I don't know if you call this a parking lot of, particularly for those of you in the legislature, of these issues that will be coming across that are really affecting our costs, which we may decide are values that we want to keep, but at least should be risen to the surface so people can take a look at them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And special education, of course, is a good example. We have to be very careful in handling it. And there's a piece of it that raises significant questions, obviously costly and often court-driven, which means that that families have pushed the envelope or pushed the right of their child to get that, let's call it adequate education, in their case, whatever it is. And so, although it has sort of this, you could call it negative cost aspect, it serves something much greater than that. And so if it needs to be parked, or maybe parked is too negative a term, put over into a list of other things that are incredibly important that need to be addressed, but we're not addressing them, then that's good. Let's do that.
I'm more interested though in, for example, and we know this from other places, sometimes changes in basic core curriculum, how you teach reading, what you do in kindergarten, can reduce significantly the proportions of kids that are identified for special needs. And whether or not, that's an accountability that somebody needs to deal with, whether it's our commission or not.
Iris has been waiting. She's got a hand up.
I just wanted to say I found the business administrators fascinating, and just about everything they mentioned was something that had been discussed but was unable to be included or funded last time around. So, every single point they made was valid. And likewise with special ed. Special ed seems to be a lot of changes from Cat Aid being morphed into 402, or I didn't follow the whole thing, but some of that didn't seem very positive. And And it seemed like it might be a good time for us to also, we had talked about recommending some further look into early childhood. We might also recommend some further look into special ed. But yeah.
Just a comment there, and Barbara, you can see that. That's where I think there are a number of bills that come out of this study committee that if we can identify some of the charge to those potential, so under special education, court-ordered costs or court-ordered placements, and chartered school special education of cost avoidance, but burdens on the school district, the transportation issues that there are. So, I think that's a takeaway without just walking away from the topic, and I think we ought to think about that for those Chris's parking lot issues. They're not just parking lots. We're going to develop a little bit of a charge and expect that that's carried out in another way.
Right.
Right, that's exactly what I was gonna say too, Jay. I don't want us, we can do the parking lot, but we're really gonna be clear and really add some meat to those parking lot items. I think that's, well, it may not be our direct charge. It's a pretty good charge there that we need to really emphasize some of those areas. So.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think a similar topic that came up with the business officers was scale and district size and school building size, which begins to touch on how our schools are organized at the district and community level. And we've seen what's happened in Vermont. We've seen what's attempted to happen in Maine. Saw huge consolidation efforts in other parts of the country like Kentucky. A really interesting article in last Sunday's New York Times about county boundaries for school districts and the ways to actually increase equity by having larger boundaries around school districts so that the costs get spread more equitably and more fairly. So that is another example. We're not charged with looking at school district organization, and thank God we're not. But if that comes up as a cost driver around efficiencies, that's then that is a way to get more money out to kids and in a more efficient way. We probably need to have that in some section of our final report, along with these other topics that need further look.
I got to sign off too. See you next.
See you.
Take care, Iris.
Bye-bye.
All right, I think before we lose more people, maybe that's a technique, decision by attrition. Bruce, I think we've covered enough of what we needed to.
Yeah, I feel really full. I want to digest this. I know Jordan took notes. We all took our own notes.
So for next week, we're going to meet on full group Tuesday. That's our only meeting that we've got scheduled.
Yes,
for next week.
after this past week, that's not bad.
Yeah. But then we'll continue on June 1st, probably with three different perspectives on the Conval case. And then we need to determine a time to meet on June 4th. That for me, I hope it will be in the afternoon on June 4th.
Yeah, just a quick heads up, Jay, on June 1st. I did get a note back from Daniel Will this morning. Not available. I'm not able to discuss ongoing litigation, and Conval falls into that category. So our vision for what we might do on June 1st might have to shift a little bit. An understandable response, not surprising actually. I'm attaching the briefs that have been filed so far, the state's opening brief, et cetera. I think we might have access to that already. Anyway, follow up on how best to organize June 1st.
Jay, just a couple of quick announcements.
Please.
Before we all sign off, that that there's no work group meeting at 1 p.m. today. Fiscal policy is going to meet along with public engagement at 3 p.m. It's the same link that you used to get on to this one. So that's tuning in. Fiscal policy, public engagement at 3 o'clock today, and I think we've got a lot of time basically earmarked for statement of work discussion. I don't think it's going to go on full 2 hours. So that'll be nice. It's been a busy week. That's the first announcement. Second announcement, and I'll be this is for all the work groups, so I'll be mentioning it at 3 o'clock too, is that just wanted to I know we're all starting to get really interested in reaching out and getting access to data. The AIR folks are as well. We're pleased with what we'd like to do is follow a process to direct all requests for information through your work group, through the work group chair. Then it'll go through Bruce, and Bruce will take care of the request through the appropriate agency or resource. So could be reaching higher, could be Department of Ed, DRA, Doug Hall, so Bruce will determine that. So it all channels through a single.
Good. All right. Motion to adjourn. Thank you.
Right. We'll see y'all at 3.
See you Saturday at 3.
All right. Take care. Yeah.